Reddit user Soul Echo posted a story so disturbing it was removed multiple times, yet it kept reappearing, posted by anonymous accounts. Soul Echo's story was about an eerie encounter in an abandoned house, one that left them forever haunted. It started as an innocent exploration. Soul Echo and their friends had heard about an old mansion on the edge of town, hidden behind thick, ancient trees and forgotten for decades. People said it was cursed, but curiosity got the best of them, and one night they decided to go. The house was dilapidated, with ivy creeping up its crumbling walls and broken windows that stared like hollow eyes. Soul Echo felt an unsettling presence even before stepping inside. Once they entered, the air grew icy. The house was silent, but somehow each creak of the floorboards felt too loud, like something was listening. Dust floated in the air and a faint, metallic smell lingered, something they later described as too close to blood. They explored cautiously, snapping pictures and joking to mask their growing unease. But as they moved deeper into the house, they noticed something odd. Their footsteps started echoing, as if the sounds bounced back with a delay, almost imitating them. They entered a grand, decaying hall lined with old portraits, each one depicting a somber face staring into the distance. One friend swore they saw the eyes move, but when they all looked, the faces were still. Soul Echo laughed it off, but felt a strange sensation, like they were being watched not by the eyes in the paintings, but by something deeper in the shadows. In a far corner, they discovered a door leading to the basement. Against their better judgment, they descended the narrow, creaking steps. The basement was cold and pitch dark, save for the light from their phones. At the bottom, they found an old, dusty mirror propped up against the wall, its glass cloudy and cracked. Something about it felt wrong, as if it absorbed light rather than reflected it. When Soul Echo glanced into the mirror, they saw themselves, but it wasn't right. Their reflection looked back with a twisted smile that didn't match their expression, and its eyes, dull and lifeless, stared with an intensity that felt almost hungry. They tried to look away, but found themselves entranced, unable to move as their reflection slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. They felt a cold pressure on their own hand, as if something was pulling them in. Their friends finally pulled them back, breaking the spell. But as they ran up the stairs, Soul Echo glanced back at the mirror. Their reflection was still there, watching them go, smiling with a cold malice that haunted their dreams for weeks. They left the house, but things only grew worse. Soul Echo began experiencing strange episodes. They'd catch glimpses of themselves in mirrors or windows, only to see the reflections smile or move independently. Shadows in their home seemed to gather and stretch, whispering just out of reach. One night, they woke up standing in front of their bathroom mirror, staring into their own empty eyes. Their reflection grinned, and in a voice that wasn't theirs, whispered, "We're almost ready." Soul Echo's final Reddit post was a desperate warning, begging readers to stay away from abandoned places and especially from mirrors. Their last words were, "If you see yourself, but it isn't you, don't look. It wants to take your place." After that, they vanished. Friends tried reaching out, but Soul Echo was gone. Months later, someone else posted a chilling update. Soul Echo's account had reactivated, posting a picture of the cracked mirror from the basement, accompanied by a single message, "I'm free." But those who knew Soul Echo noticed something disturbing. The person in the photo wasn't them, or at least not the original them. Reddit user Hollow Eyes shared a tale that quickly became notorious in online circles. A story not of ghosts or monsters, but something darker, something ancient that thrived on fear. It began when Hollow Eyes moved into a small, forgotten apartment building in a quiet part of town. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord's vacant smile and hurried assurances of just old plumbing did little to deter them. The building had a reputation, but rumors of creaking pipes and cold spots were easy enough to ignore, at first. The first night, Hollow Eyes heard soft scratching at their door. Half asleep, they dismissed it as mice or the wind. But the next morning, there were faint, deep gouges in the wood, as if made by long, sharp nails. The scratching continued every night, long, scraping sounds that grew louder and more frenzied as the hours passed. They started locking the door with every available latch, but it never seemed to matter. The sound would always be there. One night, desperate for sleep, they pounded on the door, shouting into the empty hallway beyond. Silence followed. Hollow Eyes cracked the door open. No one there. They slammed it shut, heart pounding, and turned to see something chilling. A shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room, pooling unnaturally in the corner and stretching toward them. Over the following days, strange occurrences piled up. The shadows moved on their own, always out of sight but closing in whenever they turned away. Objects would shift and disappear. Hollow Eyes would find cold, skeletal handprints smeared on the walls, as if something had clawed its way up from within the building itself. The air became heavy, suffocating, as if the apartment were trying to crush the life out of them. Desperate for answers, they spoke to the oldest tenant in the building, an elderly man who kept to himself, rarely leaving his room. "It's not the building," he whispered, his eyes hollow and sunken. "It's what's beneath it. The foundation was laid on something that was never meant to be disturbed. It likes fear. It feeds on despair." That night, Hollow Eyes couldn't sleep. The scratching returned, louder and more frantic. But this time it wasn't just at the door. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards. The apartment itself seemed alive, groaning and trembling. Shadows poured from the cracks, coiling and shifting, forming the vague outline of a tall, gaunt figure with hollow, burning eyes. It reached out, and Hollow Eyes felt a cold, suffocating grip around their chest. The figure whispered in a voice that sounded like grinding stone, "You are mine now." Hollow Eyes awoke hours later on the floor, gasping for breath. The scratches had carved symbols into every wall, symbols they didn't recognize but knew instinctively were a curse. They packed their things and fled, leaving everything else behind. But escape proved impossible. Shadows would follow them wherever they went, lurking in the corners of their vision, and the scratching never stopped. It grew inside their mind, like claws scraping the surface of their sanity. Their last Reddit post was a rambling, desperate message. "It's not the building. It's me now. I can't get away. Don't listen to the scratching. Don't let it in." No one heard from Hollow Eyes again. Months later, a new tenant moved into the vacant apartment. They dismissed the tales as mere urban legend, until the first night when the scratching began. Reddit user Shadows in the Fog shared a harrowing tale that still sends shivers down spines. It began with a long, lonely drive on a winding mountain road. Shadows in the Fog was returning home from a weekend trip when a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the world whole. Visibility dropped to mere feet, forcing them to slow their pace. The twisting, empty road became a corridor of gray, the headlights barely cutting through the dense mist. They were alone, or so they thought. After an hour of creeping along, they spotted a figure standing by the roadside, barely visible through the swirling fog. Thinking it might be a stranded traveler, Shadows in the Fog slowed the car. The figure, a tall man wearing outdated clothing, turned slowly to face them. Even from a distance, something about him was deeply unsettling. His eyes seemed too dark, too deep, and he wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Shadows in the Fog felt a chill run down their spine and drove past without stopping. A mile later, their radio crackled to life, though it had been off. Static hissed and popped before a voice, low, distorted, and humming with malice, whispered their name. The fog grew thicker, pressing against the car windows like it wanted to get inside. Shadows in the Fog gripped the wheel tightly, heart pounding, and turned up the volume, hoping to drown out the voice. But it persisted, growing louder, repeating their name with a sickening familiarity. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, like fingertips brushing against glass, but soon it became urgent, frantic, as if someone were pounding to be let in. Shadows in the Fog glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly crashed. The man from the roadside was now in the back seat, his dark eyes glimmering with something far worse than malice. Shadows in the Fog swerved, trying to keep control, as the man leaned in, whispering ancient words that seemed to resonate in their bones. Panicking, they pulled over, flinging open the car door and stumbling out into the fog. Silence swallowed them whole. They spun around, but the man and the car were gone, leaving only tire tracks vanishing into the mist. Shadows in the Fog wandered blindly, every direction the same, every step echoing as if they weren't alone. Shadows moved within the fog, shapes too tall, too angular, and too wrong. Eventually, they stumbled upon an old wooden signpost. The wood was splintered, and carved into it were symbols they didn't recognize, along with a single phrase, "The fog remembers." A sudden gust of wind blew through, dispersing the fog for just a moment, and they saw dozens of figures standing silently in the distance, all facing them, all wearing expressions of hollow despair. Shadows in the fog ran until their lungs burned and legs gave out. When the fog finally lifted, they found themselves back on the road, shivering and alone. They never spoke of what truly happened that night, only that they never drove those roads again. But the nightmares never stopped. In their dreams, the fog returned, and with it came the man with the dark eyes. He'd whisper their name, promising that one day he'd find his way back. The fog is a doorway, Shadows in the Fog warned in their final post. Never trust what it hides. Their account went dark soon after. Locals say that sometimes on foggy nights, you can hear faint whispers on that same road, and if you stop to listen, you might see a figure standing just beyond the mist. But be warned, once it knows your name, it never forgets. Reddit user Fading Whisper shared a story so deeply unsettling that it was whispered about long after the thread went silent. The story began with a simple premise: an old, cracked mirror found at a flea market. Fading Whisper had bought it on a whim, charmed by the intricate silver frame and antique feel. The vendor warned them with a knowing smile, "Mirrors remember," but they brushed it off as a creepy sales pitch. They would soon regret it. The mirror seemed ordinary at first. It hung in their bedroom, reflecting the mundane details of their life: clothes scattered across the floor, the soft glow of a bedside lamp. But after a few nights, Fading Whisper noticed something strange. When they walked by, they'd catch glimpses of movement in the mirror, even when nothing else stirred. Shadows would flicker at the edges of the glass, disappearing when they turned to look directly. Friends who visited commented on how cold the room felt and how the mirror seemed to watch. One night, unable to sleep, they sat in front of the mirror, staring into their reflection. The air felt thick, and their own eyes seemed wrong, darker, deeper. Then, for the briefest moment, their reflection smiled, though they hadn't moved a muscle. Heart pounding, they jumped back. The reflection's smile lingered a beat too long before returning to match their own shocked expression. They tried to convince themselves it was stress or a trick of the light, but over the next few days, things worsened. They'd find themselves waking up in the middle of the night, standing in front of the mirror without remembering how they got there. Their reflection moved independently, blinking when they didn't, tilting its head as if studying them. Whispering voices began to fill the room at night, soft and indistinct, like a crowd speaking just beyond comprehension. In desperation, Fading Whisper tried to remove the mirror, but it wouldn't budge. It felt anchored to the wall, as if the house itself wouldn't let it go. They covered it with a sheet, hoping to block out whatever lurked within. That night, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The sheet was ripped away, lying in shreds on the floor. Their reflections stood there, now clearer than ever. Pale, eyes black as pitch, mouth twisted in a mocking grin. The reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. Fading Whisper felt a cold, burning sensation on their chest and looked down to see an identical handprint seared into their skin. Panic set in. They posted on Reddit, begging for help, advice, anything. Most dismissed it as a hoax, but a few believed them. One user, Mirror Marked, warned, "If it wants out, don't let it touch you. You'll be trapped." The warnings came too late. One night, as they stared into the mirror, their reflection stepped forward. It pressed both hands against the glass, then pushed. With a horrible cracking sound, it emerged halfway, grinning, clawing, and dragging Fading Whisper toward the shimmering surface. The last thing they saw was their own terrified face disappearing into darkness as the reflection stepped out fully, stretching as if trying on a new suit. Their Reddit account went silent. Weeks later, a friend who visited the house reported seeing a mirror hanging in the bedroom, polished and pristine. When they looked into it, they saw Fading Whisper's face smiling back at them, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Mirrors remember," the vendor had said, and now so would anyone who dared to look too deeply into the glass. Reddit user Echoing Silence shared a story that became infamous in the r/no-sleep community, a tale of shadows, secrets, and things better left unseen. Echoing Silence was a college student living off campus in an old, rundown house with creaking floors and cracked windows. It was cheap, and the landlord was eager to rent it out, offering no explanation for why previous tenants seemed to come and go with such haste. For the first month, things were normal enough. But soon, the house revealed its darkness. It started with the tapping. Every night, as echoing silence lay in bed, there would be a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap on their window. Living on the second floor, it was impossible for it to be someone outside, but every time they worked up the nerve to check, the tapping would stop, leaving only the swaying of branches in the wind. They tried to ignore it, writing it off as an overactive imagination. But one night, as they lay awake, they heard a whisper, faint and chilling, saying their name. Things escalated quickly. The tapping grew louder and more insistent. One night, echoing silence woke up to find their room freezing cold, the air thick and oppressive. The window was wide open, though they'd locked it before bed. As they approached, something moved just out of sight, a dark figure slipping away into the night. Over the next few days, they began noticing other changes. Shadows seemed darker and stretched too far. Mirrors would fog over, revealing handprints when they wiped them clean. Whispers would echo through empty rooms, always out of reach, but unmistakably familiar. Desperate for answers, they started digging into the house's history. Local records revealed a grim past. Decades earlier, a reclusive man lived there, notorious in the neighborhood for his obsession with the supernatural. He had claimed to have found a way to pierce the veil between worlds, but vanished without a trace, leaving behind cryptic symbols scrawled across the basement walls. Echoing Silence realized they'd made a grave mistake. They had unknowingly moved into the man's house. Determined to end whatever was haunting them, they descended into the basement, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with dust and decay. On the far wall, the symbols remained, crudely etched into the stone. As they approached, their breath caught. The tapping began again, impossibly loud, as if coming from within the walls themselves. The shadows in the room twisted, and a figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. It was the man, or what was left of him, an emaciated, hollow-eyed shell with skin stretched too tight, clawed hands twitching at his sides. He spoke in a voice that echoed with 100 different tones. "You've opened the door. Now you must walk through." The basement door slammed shut, trapping them. Shadows writhed and reached, and the symbols on the walls glowed with a sickly green light. Echoing Silence felt themselves pulled into the darkness, an overwhelming cold seeping into their bones. They screamed, but no one could hear them. Hours later, they were found in the basement, barely conscious and covered in strange symbols etched into their skin. They couldn't remember exactly what happened, but knew one thing for certain. The door was open, and something had followed them back. Their Reddit posts became increasingly frantic. "Don't stay in the dark," they warned. "It's waiting there." Echoing Silence's account went dark soon after their final post. "It's inside the house. I can't get away. It's too late for me. Leave your lights on." No one heard from them again, and the house has remained vacant, shrouded in shadows that grow darker with each passing night. One of the most disturbing stories ever to surface on Reddit came from a user named Midnight Escape. It was a tale that burrowed into the minds of those who dared read it. Midnight Escape was known in their small community as someone who liked solitude, preferring quiet, long walks in the forest that bordered their property. But their last walk changed everything. On a chilly autumn evening, Midnight Escape ventured deeper into the woods than they ever had before. The trees, skeletal against the darkening sky, seemed to close in around them. As the wind picked up, they caught the faint scent of decay, a metallic, sickly sweet odor. That's when they saw it, a narrow stone archway covered in moss, standing inexplicably in the middle of the woods. Curiosity gnawed at them, and they stepped through. On the other side, the air felt different. Still. Wrong. Birds that had been chirping fell silent, and even the wind seemed afraid to blow. Midnight Escape brushed it off as nerves and turned back, only to find that the archway had vanished. Panic set in. As they retraced their steps, they stumbled upon something that wasn't there before. A clearing filled with hundreds of crude wooden dolls, each one suspended by frayed twine. Approaching one of the figures, Midnight Escape noticed something that made their blood run cold. The doll had a piece of fabric tied around its neck, a perfect match for the scarf they were wearing. They backed away, but the trees around them creaked and shifted, closing off any escape. And then, one by one, the wooden dolls turned their heads to look at them, their hollow eyes burning with a dim, hateful light. Desperate to get away, they ran blindly through the forest. They could hear whispering voices in a language they didn't understand, and the rustling of leaves as if unseen things were crawling just out of sight. They tripped and fell, bruising themselves on a strange stone marker that jutted from the earth. Scrambling to their feet, they saw symbols carved into the stone, symbols that matched the ones engraved on the dolls. Midnight Escape finally emerged from the woods hours later, exhausted and delirious. They tried to explain to friends what happened, but no one believed them. Night after night, they would wake to the sensation of being watched. In their dreams, the dolls would appear, whispering promises of despair and ruin. One morning, they discovered claw marks scratched into the walls of their home, forming the same symbols seen in the woods. Determined to escape, Midnight Escape booked a one-way ticket to the other side of the country. But on their last night before leaving, they woke to find themselves unable to move. All around their bed, the wooden dolls had reappeared, eyes glimmering with a malevolent glow. As they watched helplessly, the tallest doll, bearing a face carved with a cruel smile, stepped forward and whispered, "We are always with you." The next day, their account was deactivated. Their friends claimed they disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a room filled with crude wooden figures, each one bearing traces of the person they once were. Reddit user Crimson Whispers shared a spine-chilling experience that became infamous on the platform. It was a story of curiosity gone horribly wrong, and it began with a mysterious parcel that showed up at their door. The package was unmarked and oddly cold to the touch. Living alone in a small rural town with little excitement, Crimson Whispers figured it was a delivery mix-up or perhaps an anonymous gift. But when they opened it, their hearts sank. Inside was an old wooden box, carved with intricate symbols they didn't recognize. Alongside it was a simple note that read, "It's yours now." Confused but intrigued, they inspected the box. It was locked tight, but every time they touched it, a faint, rhythmic tapping could be heard from inside, like something gently knocking to be let out. They set it aside, trying to shake the creeping unease. That night, they woke to find the box on their nightstand, even though they'd left it in the living room. The tapping was louder, almost frantic. Crimson Whispers threw it into a closet, determined to ignore it. But as days passed, the knocking became a constant torment, impossible to drown out. Worse, shadows in their home seemed to shift when they weren't looking. Lights flickered. Whispers followed them wherever they went, always just beyond comprehension. They sought help online, but most dismissed it as a prank. Only one user, Keys of Dread, took them seriously. "Do not open it," they warned. "Destroy it if you can." Desperate, Crimson Whispers tried everything, smashing, burning, even burying it deep in the woods. But no matter what they did, the box reappeared, pristine and unscathed. The situation reached a breaking point one night when they awoke to find themselves unable to move. Paralyzed, they watched helplessly as the shadows pooled at the foot of their bed, solidifying into a shape, a tall, skeletal figure with hollow eyes. It raised one hand and pointed at the box, now resting on their chest. In a voice that crackled like burning leaves, it hissed, "Open." Unable to fight the compulsion, Crimson Whispers unlocked the box. Inside was a small, withered heart, still beating. The shadowy figure leaned closer and whispered, "It's yours now," before vanishing into darkness. The box, now empty, stopped its tapping. But it wasn't over. From that night on, Crimson Whispers' life spiraled. They began seeing glimpses of the Shadow Man in reflections, heard the relentless beating of a heart when they closed their eyes, and felt a cold, unshakable dread. They begged for help on Reddit, but their posts grew increasingly incoherent. Their last message was a simple plea: do not accept any unmarked packages. If you hear knocking, never answer. It's too late for me. No one has heard from Crimson Whispers since. A user named Lost in Static shared a story on Reddit that left readers terrified, questioning every shadow and flicker of light around them. This wasn't a tale meant for the faint of heart. It was a slow burn nightmare, the kind that sticks to your mind like a dark stain. Lost in Static recounted a job offer they couldn't refuse. The position was simple: overnight security guard at an abandoned psychiatric hospital. The pay was outrageously good, and their supervisor insisted there would be nothing to worry about. All they needed to do was walk the premises, log their rounds, and ensure that no trespassers got in. Easy money, they thought. But on their first night, they understood why no one else wanted the job. The building itself seemed to breathe, its warped floors groaning beneath their feet as they made their rounds. There were no lights beyond what their flashlight could reveal. The air was dense with a metallic smell that clung to their clothes. In one wing of the hospital where patients once underwent experimental treatments, temperatures would drop so drastically their breath formed clouds, despite it being a warm summer night. During their second shift, it began. Static crackled through their walkie-talkie, and beneath it they swore they heard voices, a low chorus of unintelligible words, like a forgotten language. They laughed nervously, chalking it up to interference. But as they turned a corner, a metal door, rusted shut for decades, suddenly slammed shut behind them. Panic set in. They pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then came the footsteps. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they echoed through the empty hallways, always getting closer. They couldn't see anyone. The flashlight flickered, then died. In the darkness, lost in static, could feel a presence, a weight pressing in on them, suffocating. Then came the whispers, and this time they recognized the words, "Stay with us." It was nearly an hour before they were found, curled up in a corner, muttering to themselves. Their coworkers dismissed their claims. But Lost in Static quit the job that night. Their story continued, though. In the days that followed, they couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. They would wake up at 3 a.m. to find their walkie-talkie crackling on their nightstand, despite it being left behind at the hospital. And in the dead of night, they would see shapes move in the corners of their room, tall figures, eyes reflecting in the dark. Their final Reddit post ended with a chilling note. If you're reading this, don't take the job. And if you hear static, run. The account went inactive shortly after. No one ever heard from them again. Reddit user Nightwatch Raven shared a story so unsettling that readers reported sleepless nights and a lingering sense of dread for weeks. This was not just another ghost story. It was a glimpse into something darker. Nightwatch Raven worked as a night shift janitor at an old, decrepit hospital that had been mostly shut down for years. Only one wing remained active, serving as a storage area for outdated medical equipment. The dim corridors, with their peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, already had an oppressive atmosphere, but Raven, used to solitude, found comfort in the monotony. That was until the basement shifts began. One evening, their supervisor asked them to clean out the sub-basement. It was a place even other staff avoided, with whispers of strange occurrences dating back decades. Raven wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. The sub-basement was a forgotten maze of rooms filled with ancient medical beds, rusting surgical instruments, and broken wheelchairs. Dust and mildew hung thick in the air. As Raven swept debris into a pile, they heard it, a soft, wheezing breath from the shadows. They spun around, flashlight trembling, but nothing was there. Assuming it was their imagination, they went back to work. Minutes later, a metallic clang echoed through the basement, followed by the sound of something scraping along the floor. This time, fear prickled their skin. They called out, but the silence swallowed their words. And then, just beyond the beam of their flashlight, they saw it. A figure. It was unnaturally tall and hunched, its limbs too long, with pale, leathery skin stretched over protruding bones. It shuffled slowly, dragging one mangled foot, its head lolling at an impossible angle. Raven stood frozen, breath caught in their throat as the thing tilted its head, as if listening. Then, with a sickening creak, it turned to face them, hollow eyes glistening and a mouth that stretched far too wide into a jagged grin. Raven bolted, tripping over rusted equipment. The air grew heavy, and they felt as if unseen hands were clawing at their back. The door to the sub-basement was close. Just as they reached it, the lights flickered and went out. In the pitch black, Raven could feel hot breath on their neck, and a low, wet chuckle reverberated through the darkness. When they finally pushed through the door and locked it behind them, the noises ceased, but they knew something had followed. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued happening. Lights would flicker when Raven walked past, shadows shifted in the corners of empty rooms, and an unbearable stench of decay would fill their nostrils whenever they were alone. The hospital staff dismissed their pleas for help, labeling them paranoid. But one evening, as they sat alone in the break room, the power went out. In the suffocating silence, the dragging footsteps began. This time, they didn't stop. The thing appeared at the doorway, its mouth opening impossibly wide, releasing a guttural scream that shattered every light bulb in the room. Raven was found hours later, catatonic and muttering about the eyes that never close. Nightwatch Raven's posts became increasingly desperate, warning readers never to work alone at night, especially in old buildings with dark pasts. Their account ended abruptly after one final post. "I can hear it outside my window. It won't stop smiling." They were never heard from again. The hospital permanently closed its doors months later, its halls left to rot, and its secrets left buried in the dark. Late at night, a Reddit user posted a chilling tale that grabbed the community by the throat. They were reluctant at first, unsure if anyone would even believe their story. After all, it sounded absurd, until it wasn't. The user, calling themselves Shadowseeker82, wrote about a particular night they would never forget. They had recently moved into a small, older apartment on the outskirts of town. The rent was suspiciously low, but money was tight, and beggars couldn't be choosers. For weeks, things were normal, if not a bit lonely. But then small things started happening. The sound of faint whispers from behind walls, cold drafts that seemed to breathe across their neck, and items inexplicably disappearing, only to reappear in strange places. One evening, Shadowseeker82 was watching TV in the dimly lit living room when a soft tapping came from the window. Startled, they looked outside but saw nothing but darkness. Brushing it off as tree branches, they tried to ignore it. But then the tapping grew more insistent, almost frantic. Summoning their courage, they flung the curtains aside, only to find an empty street. But that night was only the beginning. The tapping became a nightly occurrence, always at different windows and always when they were most vulnerable, half asleep or engrossed in work. The noises escalated, soft laughter, dragging footsteps overhead, and once a low, guttural growl that left them paralyzed in bed. One Reddit comment suggested sleep deprivation or hallucinations. But then came the recordings. Determined to prove their sanity, Shadowseeker82 set up their phone to record overnight. The next morning, they played back hours of static noise, until they heard it. Between 3:15 a.m. and 3:45 a.m., unmistakable scratching could be heard, like nails against wood, and a voice, a distorted, mocking whisper calling their name. Horrified, they moved out that very day, but not before one final encounter. As they packed in a frantic rush, they felt a presence watching from the doorway. They turned and saw the silhouette of a tall, impossibly thin figure. It stood motionless, its head slightly, as if it were amused. With no time to think, they bolted, leaving everything behind. The Reddit post ended abruptly, with the user claiming they were staying with a friend far from the apartment, refusing to ever go back. The community was stunned. Some dismissed it as fiction. Others believed every word. But the most unsettling part? Another Redditor, Nightmare Echoes, chimed in with a post of their own. They described moving into that same apartment just weeks later and hearing the same tapping,